So my name's Will and I'm from the Medically Supervised Injecting Centre in Sydney, Australia. It is a great honour to be here, and I'd just like to firstly thank my hosts Teresa and Barbara, who's obviously in another meeting, for inviting me to come along. And also to Dr. Vendula Belakova, who I'm not sure if you know or not, but she used to previously work here and was an academic here, but is now one of my colleagues in Sydney at the Injecting Centre, working on a very, very exciting project that we're hoping to launch in the next couple of years, which will then create another radical shift, hopefully, in how we approach drug issues from a very progressive harm reduction perspective. Just before I begin though, I'm very relaxed and chilled. If there's anything that I say that needs further clarification, or if I speak too fast, or if you want to ask any questions, just throw questions at me along the way. I'm very happy and open about that. I was invited to do this just as I was leaving on a 6-week vacation, so I didn't have a lot of time to prepare or to review my slides or anything. So please, if there's any gaps in anything I say, throw any questions my way. I'm very happy for that. Just to get to know you guys a little bit better, would it be possible just to quickly go around the room and to tell me who you are and the projects or work that you're doing just quickly? Now, I won't remember any of your names. Even if it was in Australia, I don't remember names well, but it would be interesting to get a sense of what you'd like to get out of the presentation and what you're actually working on. Who'd like to go first?
Okay, so actually, okay, I will start. My name is Teresa Černíková. I'm working here at the National Monitoring Center for Drugs and Addictions. And right now I'm working on a European project focused on infectious diseases among drug users.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Zuzana, and I'm working for the government. And now I
she's my colleague and she's working in our office as well.
That's
yeah.
That's good. Thank you. That's helpful.
Hey, my name is Sitka and I work here in the government's office, and I'm actually kind of interested in this topic, so that's why I'm here.
Fantastic.
Hello, my name is Renata.
Hi.
I'm colleague to Jitka and Teresa, and I work here in government.
Yep.
And my work includes transfer money to people who
To drug services.
Yes.
Very important, very important.
Yes.
More of that needs to happen.
What?
More of that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Aleš Hercog. I work I'm outreach worker. I work here in Prague in SANANIM, and we mostly are focused on the open drug market.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lucia. I work as a social street worker in Seminář. Já nevím, jak se řekne anglicky, Středočeský kraj, omlouvám se.
The region, the Central Bohemian region.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Martin. I work in SANANIM, in a contact center. Já nevím, jestli to řekne takhle.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Oh, hello, I'm Thomas, and
Hi.
I work in a similar center as
Okay.
colleague. I'm a nurse.
Okay. Thank you. I'm a nurse too.
Hello, my name is Tomáš. I'm from this house, Council of Government, and I hope that all information will interesting for you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I started my career 30 years ago as a volunteer in the Australský center in Ostrava, and now I have finished here in government.
Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Hi, I'm Christoph. I work here for the government as well on another European project that involved in like different ways to create a network of services and the needs assessment.
Okay.
I'm really interested in this.
Oh, okay.
I'm happy to be here.
Good, thank you.
Hi, I'm Gazita.
Hi.
I work in scheme.
Fantastic. And I met you before. So you all work from a range of services, but it sounds like you're all linked through the government. It sounds like that most of the services in Czech, if I'm correct, are government linked rather than non-government organisations. Is that correct or not?
I think most of the organisations working with drug users are NGOs.
They are NGOs. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
And they are funded by the government.
Okay. Okay.
Also by us.
Okay. And that's a very okay, right. Okay. So that's a very similar situation in Australia too. So Australia's a long way. It's about 24 hours flight for me to get here. So when Aussies go on holiday, we tend to want to have a lot of fun, and we tend to like spend a lot of time actually traveling, because you can't just nip across the water for like 2 or 3 days because of the high cost. And if I can just push this along, oh, that didn't work. Okay, just tip it. So, been travelling for about 5.5 weeks now. I'm a little bit tired. So as you can see there, that's a beer about the size of my face. You have massive beers here, and they're very cheap, which is just absolutely wonderful. And so beer and alcohol in Australia tends to be highly regulated and very expensive. We're starting to impose volumetric pricing onto our alcohol in order to curb some of the harms from alcohol. Alcohol's the drug associated with the most harm in Australia still. And but obviously when we Aussies get overseas, we like to let things go a bit. So that's me in Sitges. And then I went across to Manchester. Now unfortunately that's a mate of mine from London. Doesn't quite capture it, but I was at a Joy Division exhibition. So you probably know Joy Division. It was a massive band in the 70s until the lead singer Ian Curtis suicided. But then it formed the basis of many other bands like New Order and The Cure and Depeche Mode and so on, and some of those inspirational bands. And that was a bit of fun. But and there's me in, then I moved up to Northern Ireland, which I've just been with my family, which I was very glad to get away with. Although Northern Ireland was beautiful, my family were just horrible people to travel with, if I'm honest. But anyway, that was on the Causeway, the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, a beautiful area. Now, going back to Manchester, whenever I travel, I always like to look at the underbelly of any city I'm having a look at. Now, I don't know if you know, in United Kingdom, they have all these canals, which are still in existence and live today, and you can actually access them by canal boats. So in a lot of the underground areas in the major metropolitan areas, you've got these canals. And they used to be, back in the day, working canals where all of the, where industry would lug all of their wares that they produced onto these canal boats and then ship them down somewhere else to where they would go to market, or they put all their raw materials and bring them. It's almost like a backdoor way for industry. But they're still alive today. So underneath Manchester, you can actually walk down in the canals. And of course, that's something I did. And the first thing I saw on the hand railing as you walk under this canal was a used discarded syringe. And then as you walked a little bit further down, on the right-hand side, just inaccessible to the public, but in clear public view, was a group of about 6 or 7 homeless drug users, all injecting in this squat. And I'm just drawn to this, I have to say. It was just fascinating to see that in this cold area, they had access to clean needles, but there was nowhere safe for these individuals to actually inject. And I just wondered what would happen, because Manchester and those areas are primarily opiate-based communities, opiate-using communities. If they overdose, what sort of support would happen? Because they're injecting furtively, and they're injecting in a kind of an area which would be difficult for emergency services to access. And I just found that really fascinating. And it just shows me that no matter where you go in the world, drug use happens, injecting drug use in particular happens, and it's important for us to have progressive harm reduction services wherever drug use happens. So I just found that fascinating on my travels. And then I was in beautiful Belfast. Belfast has had a troubled history, as we know. This was the town hall that got bombed many times during the troubled years of 1969 to the late 90s, when the peace accord was signed. Now, during the 16th and 17th century, this open area that you see here was a place where if you had an axe to grind, if you had something political to say, you would get up, you'd soap your box, and you would announce to the public what your troubles and what your issue was, and then people would argue back with you, and that's what they did in order to, you know, to propel somebody's individual agenda. And you can see a little statue there of somebody actually with a newspaper in their hand, you know, beating the mantle. But then also, interestingly, and this was a Sunday, you can see 3 individuals sitting on the steps there at the town hall in public view. Now, I didn't want to encroach on their privacy, so I stood well back and made sure they weren't identifiable. But they're actually sitting around a little cooking mix, cooking up what I assumed was some heroin. And it could have been anything else, but you could see the individual cookers, and that usually indicates that heroin is being cooked up. Again, Belfast doesn't have access to good harm reduction services. It doesn't have access to drug consumption rooms. So there they are in public view, injecting and obviously at risk of overdose. And I just found that fascinating. And then I had a couple more whiskies, and then something really bizarre happened. And then they're the Marie Antoinette sisters talking to some local constabulary in Manchester. And that seemed to sum up my kind of like raucous holiday so far. Anyway, without further ado, that's just a little about me to lighten up the room. So what I thought I'd talk about, the key things were, what are SIFs and DCRs? And do you know what I mean by SIFs and DCRs? Is that, so when you look at the collective literature on public amenities where you can go and inject, they're often referred to as either supervised injecting facilities or drug consumption rooms, and they tend to be used interchangeably. So they're shortened to SIFs and DCRs. Have you heard those terms used before? Perhaps not, okay. And so what I thought I'd do is look at the evidence for those, and then I'd look at the specifics of the Sydney Medically Supervised Injecting Facility where I work, and talk about the practicalities of how we got off the ground, and why we exist and how we operate and what we do that's so novel and different. And then look at the particular clinical practice around that. And then I have this really short 14-minute film to show you at the end of that. And at any stage, ask me any questions along the way. How am I travelling? Good? Fantastic. And I'm sorry, I get a little bit anxious when I talk, and I talk at a very loud volume, so you won't have any trouble hearing me along the way. But you might need to get me to slow down if I'm not making any sense to you.
I ask you please to speak slower.
Slower? Okay, I will try. Can you remind me many times? Because I get quite passionate and I get carried away. So please, honestly, slow me down if you need to. So, drug consumption rooms and supervised injecting facilities are nothing new. The first one opened in Bern in Switzerland in 1985, and there's now about 100 of these facilities around the world today. There's 21 in Germany at the moment. They have them in Spain, they have them in many other places. They have one that's just opened in Paris. There's another one proposed for Paris also. they're proposing them for Dublin. In fact, Dublin in Southern Ireland has passed legislation that will mean that there will be a injecting centre set up in about 2 years there. Canada has had one. Australia was the first in the English-speaking world to set up a drug consumption room, and we remain, and it remains the only one in the Southern Hemisphere. Canada shortly followed in Vancouver. 18 months later, they set up a supervised injecting facility called Insight, and now there's another 14 SIFs proposed for Canada. So most of the world is on top of this and has been really progressive with this. Now, the way SIFs and DCRs operate varies differently from country to country. So some have a very clinical medical model, such as the one in Australia and Canada, but others have a very different model that's set more around, I hate using this expression, but it's referred to as the public nuisance model. And that's more where they set up a room, basically, which is off the street, that invites people into the centre, in a low threshold centre, where they can do it in a non-public space. Oh, hello. Some of these facilities have clinical staff and some don't. So at the service where I work, we have a medical director who oversees all the medications and the service operation. And then it's basically run by people like me and other registered nurses. And we also have a team of experienced health education officers that do a lot of drug and alcohol counselling and so on. But some of the facilities around the world just have peer workers, and some have maybe one registered nurse for the whole facility. Some facilities have naloxone on site and some don't. But all of them have been demonstrated through good evidence to be very effective in saving lives and reducing the harm from drug use. Are there any questions about that? Am I talking honestly sense check, and how am I going in terms of...
When you have started with this IT in Australia, have you met your colleagues from Switzerland before to consult with them how to do it, how to start it out?
It was very interesting at the opening of our centre back in 2001. There was a number of working groups that went over into Europe to learn from their experience. One of the interesting challenges has been being the first in the English-speaking world, and we had our own unique political and context in which we operate, which I'll speak to in a moment. There was very little published in English, so really we had to almost reinvent the wheel of how to go about doing this, because back in the early 2000s there was very little information sharing, and there was certainly very little published in English, so it's almost like we had to start from scratch and develop our new model. And the model that was developed in Australia, I would say, is arguably very different from most of the models in Europe. It was a more expensive model, it was a very medicalised clinical focus model, and it was the one that was then adopted in Vancouver. Now, there were arguments to and for that type of model, which we can talk to in a moment. But I guess my main point is that these services are not new, but they've been all shown that it doesn't matter what model you adopt, they are all very effective. And I thought what I'd do now is talk about some of the evidence which has been published, which shows that they work.
So there are two main models of these drugs?
There's more, and so there are some which are just peer-based models. Do you know what I mean by that? It means run by drug users for drug users with no medical or clinical staff. And some of those services, what happens is they provide a safe and supportive place at very low cost. They're low threshold. And what happens is the drug user can come in, they inject on site, and then if something goes wrong, then they call an ambulance.
How many projects are mobile? It means in vans or in cars?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I know only a minority. But I do know that, for example, in Spain, they did start off with a mobile model, and then when that demonstrated to be effective, then they developed fixed sites that followed that. There's some arguments to and for the mobile model. It is great in terms of mobility, so if your active drug scene is mobile and moves around, then you can follow it. The other argument based is on a population based. You can't get enough people through a van, for example. It's just not safe. We see over 200 visits per day in Sydney, and in our service. That's a lot of people. You literally just cannot get 200 people through a van. In Vancouver, they see around over 600 visits a day. That's a lot of people, you know. That's a lot of people. And then you have several overdoses every day. You simply, a van would not work in those contexts. So there's arguments for both. I'm strongly a proponent of identifying where the active drug scene is, identifying where the ambulance call data shows most of the overdoses are occurring, and then set up a fixed site there. And then obviously if it changes, then moving the site. All right. So, is this useful? I'm happy to adapt if this is like a dull or not useful, but I just thought I'd like to set the scene of why these services are important and what the evidence shows. Again, these are pragmatic harm reduction health services, and we very much follow the body of public health evidence and develop that body of evidence to demonstrate to our legislators, to demonstrate to those who finance us, that these are proven necessary health services that need to be embedded into our health system as a pragmatic, structured approach to working with the drug issues of society holistically. And so, essentially, supervised injecting facilities are legally sanctioned facilities that enable personal consumption of previously obtained illicit drugs under the supervision of qualified personnel in a non-judgmental environment. And that would be your working definition of what these services are. And just to quickly go back on the different models, some services allow just injecting. And so in Sydney, we only allow injecting. So if you come in wanting to snort drugs or smoke drugs, we won't permit that on site. So again, in the unique context of Sydney, where we have a strong injecting culture, and drugs are super expensive in Sydney. We pay the most expensive prices in the world. Methamphetamine, which I know is a big issue in Czech, for example, we pay between 60 and 80 Australian dollars for 0.1 of a gram. So that's fucking expensive. Like, if I can, that's really expensive. And for cocaine, for example, we pay 350 Australian dollars for a gram of cocaine. That's invariably shit. Like, it's terrible. And so we pay about 50 to 60 Australian dollars for a single hit of heroin, for example. Now, if you look at Berlin, for example, Germany, where I've just been, methamphetamine, for example, goes for around, what was I told? It was...
Around 10 euros.
What's that?
Around 10 euros.
Yeah. So I'd have to do the you'd want the calculation in euros, do you?
Sorry.
Would it help if I did the calculation in euros? Okay. Do you have time for me to do that quickly?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Is that helpful?
Yes.
40 jeden gram víka?
No, 10 euro?
Ne.
10 euro se neprodávají na Semináři. Bylo lepší kontakty, ale možná stovky v Karvína.
250 korun, ne?
No, ale
250
Okay, so here we go. So if you just give me a moment, I will tell you what so 0.1 of a gram, which is a very small deal of methamphetamine, for example, would be it would equal, that's about 47 euros for 0.1 of a gram. Yeah.
Jako 0.1, to znamená jako 10 gramů, 100 mg. 100 milligrams.
No, 0.1 of a gram.
1 gram.
Yeah, yes, 0.1 of a gram. So 1 gram would be 10, would be 10 points. So, okay, so that's, I see what you're saying. So that's 700, 17 to 70. Let's do it into grams. So 468 euro for a gram of methamphetamine in Australia.
In Australia.
Yeah. Do you get a sense, when I say we pay very expensive prices, do you get a sense what I mean? Australia is in the southern hemisphere. It's very, you know, most of our drugs come from Southeast Asia. They're imported into the country. That's super expensive. And people are paying those prices. But the reality is it's heavily policed. There's prohibition on illicit drugs, but the supply of drugs into the country is just huge. We know that prices are not increasing, which is an indication that supply reduction methods, policing methods are not working, you know, and that we have an active drug scene. And Australians are drug pigs. We consume some of the highest rates of drugs of any country in the world, despite the high prices. You know, to give a little sense of the scene in Australia. Now, all right. So the evidence around the effectiveness of these services is now very strong. So we know that drug consumption rooms attract high-risk drug users who are very marginalised into the service. And they do that by having very low threshold or very low barriers for accessing the service. And they do that by making sure that we have trained staff who are not arseholes, who don't stigmatise people and treat people without judgment and treat people with respect. They're core fundamental skills that we embed in our staff and that we expect when we're recruiting. We work, and I work, of a very social justice, human rights basis, and that everyone is entitled to access and fair and equitable treatment, and that's the premise that guides me in my work. And many of the people we see are the most marginalised and vulnerable members of the community. Many of our clients are homeless. Many have untreated mental illness, which has gone untreated for many, many years. And most of the clients that we see have traumatic childhood histories. And when you look at the social determinants of health, it's understandable why the clients that we see take drugs in large quantities and do so in harmful ways. But they're entitled to equal access to healthcare. That doesn't represent all of the clients that we see, but we have a certain subpopulation of people who have been very harmed by traumatic histories, and that's led on to a self-medication type approach to why they use drugs. Is that controversial for anyone? I'm seeing looks. That's certainly not the majority of people who use drugs per se. It is the majority of people that we see, and they're the ones that we want to see because they're the individuals that actually don't have access to healthcare and support in any other way. And many of the clients that we see are not accessing the health and social welfare system in any other capacity. They come in and see us, they get treated with respect, they get supported to inject in a safe environment, to do something that would be otherwise done furtively in some back alley and public toilet. And then over time, once that respect is being developed, then they'll ask for support later. if and when. But even if they never ask for support and they just kept alive and well, that's okay. And all of the...
Maybe we will talk about it later, but first question, do you provide some feedback for them as well? Or you like your career is going down and your house, I see your house is going down, or is it just respectful environment where you can inject as long as you want?
It's both. So it's that. So we work with a very harm reduction perspective. In other words, we don't expect people change to get access to health. You can come in and inject in a safe environment, and then if you overdose, we keep you alive. And if that's all you want from us, that's okay. We don't expect anything else. We meet you where you're at, rather than expecting you to change to come and work.
But on the other hand, when you see the career, the drug career of the individual is going down, his health is going down, it's not improving, it's decreasing, do you feel comfortable then to tell them, hey, what I see?
Yes, I would do that. So I'm a referral coordinator, and that's primarily my role. So once I've got that rapport with somebody over time, then I would intervene and say, hey, I've noticed these things happening. Is there some sort of support that I can provide? And here's some suggestions. But it's very much working with an individual to make them feel like they're a person to be met, not a problem to be fixed. And it's about changing that ethos about how you work with people. Do you know what I mean by that, when I say that? We don't like treating people like they're a problem to be fixed. We don't want that medical model of you're walking in, you're a disorder or a problem and we have to change you. You're okay the way you are, even though you use drugs. Come in and do it safely, and then we'll work with your goals. What is it that you want for your life, and then provide the support around that. It's a specific style of working with people that we think is very effective. Okay. Secondly, we know that injecting centres are very effective at managing drug-related overdose. At the MSIC, we have supervised over 6,500 overdoses on site, opiate overdoses. We have never had a single fatality. That's 6,500 overdoses in 16 years and not one death. Now I think that's testament in and of itself of how effective these services can be. There has never been a drug-related death recorded at any injecting centre around the world. Not one.
How much?
What's that, sorry? 6,500 overdoses in Sydney on our site, and not one person has ever died. That's powerful. We see about 1 to 2 overdoses every day, and that we manage on site. And I've got a little video that I'm going to show you an overdose in action and what we do. And there's never been an overdose death in any of the 100 services around the world. Now, you know, overdose is a massive cause of fatality and morbidity and mortality around the world. In the United States at the moment, where they have an opiate epidemic, there's 142 deaths every day from drug overdose. 142 every single day. It is an opiate crisis in the United States because of a whole range of reasons to do with the misprescribing of opiate analgesic medications. And we're following suit in Australia, and it's likely to be a trend that follows around the world. It's certainly happening in many places in Europe and the UK now. And drug consumption rooms are great places to prevent death from overdose. And the drug naloxone, are you familiar with naloxone? Not fantastic. Having naloxone on site and making sure that you have peer distribution of naloxone. Do you know what I mean by peer distribution? So peers are drug users. So it's working with drug users themselves and empowering drug users to save their mates' lives by giving them an active supply of naloxone. And we do that in Sydney too. So they're very evidence for that. They're evidence for enhancing safer injecting practices And what I mean by that is people come in with all sorts of poor injecting techniques, reusing needles. We supply as many clean needles as the person requests. They get to use those needles on site to inject whatever drugs they want, and then they dispose of them in a yellow sharps container on site, you know, and they're very good. So you've got safe disposal of needles, so you're not getting discarded needles in the street, and then you're getting education. So when somebody's injecting really badly, I can actually sit next to somebody while they're injecting and say, actually, have you thought about rotating the site and using that arm? Actually, that syringe is now full of blood. Why don't you remix the solution again in water and providing that harm reduction advice and inject in a different way? I can sit with the person while they're actually injecting. The advice isn't like they come to me and saying, I'm having these issues. I can actually sit them and watch them and work with somebody injecting to teach them a more appropriate injecting practice and give them as many needles as they want. And we have wheel filters for filtering the non-soluble excipient matter from tablets. Many of our drug users are injecting OxyContin and fentanyl and drugs which are meant to be taken orally or on the skin, and teaching them a safer way to inject that, again from a harm reduction perspective, and then keeping people alive that way.
Can we go back, please, about naloxone? So, your center teach drug users to know if somebody near the drug user has overdose?
Yes.
So they know how it looks, what they should do.
So it's a great training opportunity. If you're in an open room and you see somebody overdose, people get to witness what happens and they get to see what we do. And then that's a learning opportunity. And then we can train the drug user, look, if you're not here and you're in some place where there's no medical support, we can actually train the person how to respond to the overdose. We can actually then prescribe to them a dose of naloxone, and they can take that with them. And then when they're in that situation, they can actually use that and reverse the overdose themselves while they're waiting for the ambulance. And we know that many, many lives have been saved with that.
So everybody can get this naloxone?
Everyone in Australia, everyone can get the naloxone now. So we give naloxone on site, but we also give a supply of naloxone to the drug users themselves, who are at high risk of overdose, and then they can take it away and save their lives. And because we're the only point of contact with the health system for many of the people we work with, then that's a really valuable opportunity to provide education around safer injecting, education around overdose prevention, and providing the tools in order to save people's lives when they're not with us. Am I talking too fast again?
Okay.
Are you sure? Okay. Keep me in check.
And are you, and so it means that you use naloxone in your room?
Yes.
And I think that sometimes it maybe happened that somebody is on the border to be overdosed, but it's maybe possible to go it through, and he must be really upset that if you have the drug so expensive that you use naloxone. How is it? Happens in this?
It's a really good question. I get that asked a lot. In most cases, no. So the thing about an opiate overdose, what happens is when you're overdosed, you become amnesic. And what I mean by that is you have no memory of what happens. So people have an overdose, and what happens is they wake up and think, oh, what happened? I just nodded off for a couple of seconds, not realising they were blue on the floor. You can actually inject them with naloxone and they've not even known. They only find out when you tell them later. We use 800 micrograms of naloxone, which is the sweet spot. It's just enough to reverse the overdose and get them breathing again, but without actually putting them into withdrawal. It seems to be perfect for that dose. And the reality is when it happens on site, the person who wakes up, who not realise they had an overdose, they say, why did you overreact? And all their mates go, no, mate, you were blue on the floor, you were dead, they saved your lives. And they actually come in and defend us, because it's their mates who can see how serious it was. and they're more likely to believe their mates than they are us, you know, and it seems to work really well. I can't recall ever, I've worked there 10 years, an aggressive incident due to us giving naloxone. We only give it when it's necessary. One of the wonderful things about responding to overdoses on site is that in 1 out of every 4 overdoses, because we see it happen immediately, by giving somebody oxygen, by encouraging them to breathe, we can reverse most overdoses just by doing that without using naloxone. It's only 1 out of every 4 overdoses do we use naloxone, and that's because it's super serious. Yeah, it works really well, and it's been done safely. I'm going to talk a little bit, so please.
I'm speaking Czech. I'm sorry. Já jsem nepochopila, takže vlastně někdo má předávkování a oni, když používají ten naloxon, tak vlastně ten člověk se probudí a co?
Většinou se nepamatuje,
se nepamatuje, že...
Ti ostatní, kteří tam jsou v té místnosti, řeknou, že byl
že byl modrý na zemi, že se přestřelil, oni si to nepamatují.
Aha, takže jako vlastně ten naloxon funguje fakt hned.
Ale hlavně asi dávají ho poměrně malé množství, takže tady, když se člověk předávkuje, tak dostane takové množství naloxonu, že má hnedka jako všechny ty opiáty z těch receptorů pryč. A tady se zdá, že ho používají nějak jako drobně, takže ten člověk není v abstiáku, když se probudí, takže není naštvaný, jak jsem se ptal, jestli nejsou naštvaní, že přišli o takovýhle množství.
Že když je ta droga tak drahá, takže když dostanou ten naloxon, tak vlastně přijdou od...
Does the 800 milligrams of naloxone works same on the people who start with opium abuse or like on 400 milligrams or for people who take 3 grams a day? Does that work the same?
So you're absolutely right, it can vary. 800, look, there's no hard science behind 800 micrograms. It just seems to be the sweet spot that works for most people to get them breathing without putting them into withdrawal. I've never seen it put anyone in withdrawal. What I will say though, there are some people who've had large amount of benzodiazepine medications or alcohol or use huge doses or have overdosed on methadone, which is a long-acting opiate, might need what we refer to as a rescue dose of naloxone, and that's a second dose. It's interesting, most of the take-home naloxone programs around the world only use 400 micrograms of naloxone, and that tends to work for most people too, but they were more likely to require a rescue dose. So on site at MC, we just find 800 micrograms seems to be to work. There's no hard, naloxone just is very effective and very safe. You can do no harm with it, it can only save a life. So I tend to think that the balance, you're not going to do any more harm with 800. 400 you're more likely to need to go again. Why not just go in with the 800? The ambulance officers in Australia used to give 2 grams, straight 2 milligrams, and that it worked, but it put somebody straight into withdrawal, and that's a shitty thing. You don't want to do that to someone, you know. So what I thought, I can talk about that a little bit more, but just to finish this slide off. So in terms of the published evidence, we know that they decrease public drug use. We know that in Australia that we make contact with 85% of the local drug users in the area. They're very much a local solution to a local problem. They increase access to treatment. Now, our role is to keep people alive and to create a safe place for people, but the reality through that transaction, through me treating you with respect and without judgment and making contact, and we're talking about a group of people who are stigmatised and discriminated and treated like shit wherever they go. You change that discourse for people, and all of a sudden, these are health-seeking drug users. They're coming to our service because they don't want to die and they want to be treated with respect and a safe place. And over time, what happens is you change their thinking about interacting with others, you know. And what happens is then they'll start, oh, I trust you, Will. Oh, actually, I've got this really embarrassing thing, and can we go and have a chat about it? And then over time you can counsel somebody and then link them in with support. It happens, not because we're forcing people into treatment. That's not our goal. We're not trying to cure or fix people, but people invariably ask for support and help when the trust and the rapport is established. And that's why working with any marginalised group, whether they be Indigenous people, whether they be drug users, it's about the respect and rapport and non-judgment. And you'll hear me talk about those things a lot because they're essential. They're just essential. And so, yes, so we know that they increase access to treatment. And they're cost effective. So I hate looking at things from an economic perspective, but reality is we need to demonstrate things to our finance people and so on. The reality is that these services save money. They just do. Economic analysis of our service showed we only needed to save 0.8 of a life per year to be cost neutral. Now it's a very bureaucratic way of looking at it, but that's the stats. We've certainly saved more than 0.8 of a life per year. And so that means we're saving money to the taxpayer. Every time somebody dies and there's a coronial investigation and the ambulance has to be called out and there's the lost productivity years, that's an impact on a family, but it's also an impact on the economy as well. And we're saving we're restoring dignity and saving money to the public too. And we know that these services do not increase drug use. We've known for a long time giving needles to drug users doesn't encourage people to inject. This is an established group of people who are injecting anyway. So this doesn't increase drug use, and we have a lot of research to show it doesn't. And it doesn't increase crime. So crime use in King's Cross, where Sydney is like the injecting centre in Sydney is located, crime has reduced in that area. Not because of us, but despite us. Please.
Můžete prosím někdo přiložit moji otázku? Mě by zajímala, v jakých lokalitách máte aplikační místnosti ve městě?
In which kind of area you have these rooms for the application? In which kind of areas in your city or town you have these application rooms?
Unfortunately, because of politics, only one exists in Australia and only one exists in the Southern Hemisphere. And that's bullshit, but it's how it is. It's just the politics of the situation. So there was a lot of controversy and there's a lot of upheaval to get this one up and running. And then, unfortunately, there hasn't been the political willpower to set up another one. Although there is another one that's going to be set up in Melbourne, which is in a southern state in Victoria, hopefully in the next 2 years. There's been a number of deaths in that area, and there's been a coronial inquiry where the coroner's strongly come out recommending another injecting centre. And then there's been a parliamentary inquiry going ahead, which is also now looking at the feasibility of another service, and it's strongly come out in favour too. So all things going well, we'll have another one in Melbourne, which will be wonderful.
In your center, is it in industrial area, residential area?
No, that's a great question. Let me get to that. How do I make that work? The MSEC was set up in Sydney and King's Cross, and King's Cross is what we refer to as our red light district. Do you know what I mean by red light district? No. Yeah, it's a place where there's a lot of partying and a lot of pubs. There's sex workers and there's brothels and there's that area. And we have had an active drug scene in King's Cross since probably the end of the Second World War, but certainly at the end of the Vietnam War. We had a lot of Vietnam veterans from the United States come in to Australia, into our red light area for sex and booze, and they brought all their heroin with them, and that created an active drug scene in the King's Cross of Sydney, and it's remained the red light area and and the active drug scene ever since, and that seems unmovable at the moment. And so these services work well where you have to set them up where there's an active drug scene, where people are injecting in public and or using drugs in public, and where there's a lot of overdoses in a concentrated area, and you get that information from your ambulance call-out data. I'm assuming you have ambulances in Czech, so you get their information, and you find out where they attend to overdoses most frequently, and then that's where you can identify you need to set the service. You have to set the service up where the issue is drug users don't travel. What happens is drug users tend to go and buy their drugs in a certain area, and then at least in Australia they'll want to use the drugs within 100 metres of where they purchased their drug. So you need to set the centre up there in order for them to be effective. That would be some essential advice around that, you know. There was arguments that we should set it up near the hospital or in some back street somewhere, and we thought, there's no point, people won't travel to that, you know. And then when we surveyed people who use drugs themselves, they said that, well, they're not going to travel several streets and a couple of blocks away, they're going to use them here, where they always have.
And besides the discussion with politics and so on, has there been a discussion between you as a providers and the community, if there is some?
It was absolutely instrumental. So we were set up as a clinical trial, which meant that we could be closed down at any time. And part of the survey was that we had to have majority support of local residents, majority support of local businesses, and we had to have the police on side. And so they did a number of surveys and so on to ensure that that happened. But let me tell you about how we got them on side in my next slide, because that was really important. So when the government set it up, they didn't want to run it themselves, so they auspiced it out to an NGO. Now they initially gave it to St Vincent's Hospital, which is a Catholic institution. So the Vatican stepped in through our George Pell and said no, that was inappropriate for their service. The Vatican literally stepped in and said they didn't want to run an injecting centre. And so another Protestant-based church, the Uniting Church, actually stepped in, and they have a huge social justice thing, and they actually paid for us to run. Now it's interesting, I'm an atheist. The organisation itself has no religious affiliation and doesn't run on a religious bent at all, but we're actually linked in with this Uniting organisation, which is really interesting mix, you know. But they actually wear their social justice credentials on their sleeve. They're not trying to push a religious agenda through our service, and we certainly don't, you know. It's not something that I would stand for personally, or the director of the service, who's also an active atheist. Sorry to any Christians in the room. And another part of the service was, it's run by the government, it's run through the NGO, it's also the licence holders of the New South Wales Police, and the local community has a representative board so that they can have active input. And that's part of how we advocate for the service, by being inclusive and taking all views and making sure that the community, we're a community organisation and a community solution to a local problem. We want to make sure all the active stakeholders are understanding of what we do and are kept informed, and that's been a key part of how we operate. All right, and we're funded through the confiscated proceeds of crime. And what that means essentially is that every time a big drug dealer or something gets busted and they liquidate all their jet skis and their houses and so on, that forms a pool of funds in Treasury, which then goes to fund us. So the funding for our service doesn't directly compete with the health budget. So it's directly from drug dealers being busted, that money comes down to support our service, so we can actually support, I guess, the people who use drugs.
Může se financovat?
Z toho, co zadrží.
Aha.
so...
And this fund is governed by whom? It's not your fund, it's some fund which gives you money, but who?
Okay. So it's the government gives us money. They have a special pool of funds in Treasury, which is not budgeted allocated to other things, and so it's the confiscated proceeds of crime. So
but government runs it.
They run it, but it's a separate pool of funds. So the government in Australia, and I don't know how it works here, when they all have all the money from taxpayers, they have to, their legislation has to be passed to decide where it goes. There's a special pool just for confiscated proceeds of crime. So every time a drug dealer gets busted, that money, all their assets get taken away, and that forms body money, and that's where we get our funds.
So your funding depends on police effectivity.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting irony? The reality is there's loads of money in that fund. There's millions of dollars. Our service costs about $3.5 million Australian dollars per year to run out of interest. We're one of the more expensive services to run now.
And do they finance something else from this fund as well?
What's that, sir? Yeah, it does rehabs and other drug treatment services and so on, not just us. Yeah. Let me, sorry, just excuse me, I'm mismanaging that. Okay. All right. Now, back in, how do I go back? There we go. So this is Sydney. So this is a fairly typical view of the Sydney Harbour. It's beautiful, of course. The injecting centre is about 6 or 7 minutes away from this scene. So King's Cross is kind of just on the across the harbour from where that is, and a little bit further up is where King's Cross is located. And this is King's Cross. That's the famous Coca-Cola sign on the corner. Okay. So quickly on the history. Now, back in the 1990s, there was a glut of heroin in Australia. And there were, it got to the point where the rate of overdoses in Australia actually exceeded the national road toll. There were so many overdoses, it was a major, major issue, and all of the tabloid newspapers were reporting on it heavily. And then there was, at the same time, there was a Royal Commission into police corruption in New South Wales, where the police were very corrupt. And what was happening is, in the brothels in King's Cross, you could hire a little room for 30 minutes to an hour to have sex in, but drug users were going in there and hiring those rooms, buying their drugs from the counter as well, and going in and injecting. And then the proprietor of the brothel would come around and kick all the doors, and if because he knew what was happening, and then if somebody didn't respond, they would call the police. Now, during this police inquiry, the Royal Commissioner actually identified, well, actually, that's not an ideal situation, but at least it did provide some public benefit, that at least somebody did check on people, and then they would at least call for help. So one of his recommendations was to set up a supervised injecting facility. So it was in that context. Then there was a parliamentary inquiry in '97 that said, no, too controversial, we don't want that. And then there was so many overdoses, and then there was on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which is our tabloid newspaper, there was a photograph of an adult injecting a 17-year-old child. And that garnered like furore around the country, and everybody said, it's terrible, what are we going to do? So the government, that's the tabloid papers, the government of the day said, look, to address the heroin crisis in Australia, we'll have a national drug summit. And if I got re-elected. He was re-elected, and true to his word, he held a national drug summit, and he called across drug and alcohol experts from across the country, people who use drugs themselves and so on. And for the first time in Australia's history, we talked about the drug issue in a very non-partisan way. and there were 174 resolutions from that summit. Most of them were non-controversial by having more needle syringe programs, more methadone places and so on. But the controversial one was to set up a supervised injecting facility as a clinical trial, and we opened our doors in May 2001. And that's kind of the lead up to it. Now, there was a lot of surveys of the local community that showed, there was a telephone survey that showed that most residents and businesses actively supported it. And the reason they supported it is the businesses and residents in that area, they were stepping over needles every day of the week. When they were coming out, when they were getting up to go to work, invariably they were stepping over overdosed bodies in their driveways and so on. The issue got that bad, and there was a recognition in the area that something had to change. Now, if you have a look at this, that was a typical scene in King's Cross back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Today, it would be rare to find a used needle in King's Cross at all. This was also another terrible scene, which was very, very common in King's Cross. There was daily attendances to overdoses. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware, it's not just, the overdoses don't just kill you. When you have hypoxia for a period of time, when you're on the nod, you're getting insufficient oxygen to your brain. That will lead to cumulative hypoxic brain injury. So it's not just that you die, it's that over time you will end up with poor cognitive function, even if you survive. And the more times you go on the nod, the more likely you will have cumulative brain injury. So at the injecting centre, by applying oxygen immediately, we're not just keeping people alive, we're keeping people's brain cells healthy so that people can function well into the future. Is that a surprise to anyone? So, the success of the injecting centre, and like them speak for themselves, we have supervised over 1 million injections in Sydney. That's 1 million times that somebody has not shared a needle. That's 1 million times when somebody has not been at risk of an overdose death. And that's 1 million times when somebody has disposed of their needle in a sterile shut container. And that's 1 million occasions when we have made contact with a generally hard-to-reach population and provided them with care and support. There have been no fatalities on site. We make contact with about 2,500 individuals per year, and we supervise about 200 to 250 injecting episodes per day. There has been an 80% reduction in ambulance call-outs to the area. That's significant. That means that's a very valuable and expensive resource which can then be diverted to other places.
The people must be registered to use your services, or you can provide it anonymously.
Say again, sorry?
Do the people have to be registered?
Yes. So what I'll do is, that's my next slide actually, absolutely. Yeah. And there's been no impact on crime in the area. Now, bloody hell. Right, there we go. So, if you have a look at the, how much time have I got? Have I got a bit?
As much as you
Okay. I'll try not to keep it going for too long. So it's a 3-stage custom-built building. It's a one-way service. So you can see, you go in the entrance here. That's the reception area, and I'll talk about the registration process. Then you go into the stage 2 area, and that's the injecting area, where you have 8 stainless steel booths, and you have the staff area here, which is stainless steel. So you walk up to the booth there, staff will give you the equipment, and we have a whole variety of different equipment that I'll talk about. And then you would go and the client would go and sit at one of the booths, and the staff can see each and every booth from there. And then we don't want to be over-imposing, so we leave the clients alone. So the client will, however, call us over if they want some vein care advice or some other support. But obviously we can see the very early signs of overdose very quickly, and then we can respond. That's what we're trained for. Then when they finish injecting and they're fine, and most people walk out okay, they walk out into this third room, which is the aftercare or the chill-out area as we call. Now people can use the toilet, have a tea and coffee, read a newspaper, go on the nod, and we have clinical staff there to watch people. And this is where most of the active work about drug treatment referrals or counselling or linking people into homeless support will occur. And that's where that happens. Or people can just piss off and just go straight through and leave straight away if they want. It's whatever they want, you know. We don't impose, it's a low threshold service, so we don't impose too many rules on people, but we do provide access to support if and when people want.
This way through your center is because of the prevention of some selling drugs. That sometimes happens that people are waiting in front of the center or and ask other people if they have something. So you have this way through the center because of it?
Yes, yes. So it's a one-way system and you go out, and it's exactly that. It's about crowd control, but it's about reducing the opportunities for any sort of drug dealing and that sort of stuff. So we have very clear rules where having drugs on you and using drugs is okay, but swapping drugs or selling drugs is not okay. And we have a range of sanctions and penalties so that if you're caught infringing on our rules, and we have very few rules but we have some, then you might get timed out from the service for a particular day, or for very serious offences you might get banned, but we don't like banning people. And if there's any serious drug dealing or something, then we are required to contact the police.
And but how often it happens that, for example, somebody who don't have drugs and needs some is waiting in a Darlinghurst street and asking people who are coming to your center?
It happens quite a bit. It happens quite a bit, and we can explain to people that actually you jeopardise the existence of the service, and most people are receptive to that and then try and do that further up the street, where it's away from the service. Remember, drug dealing is happening in the street anyway, it always was, so that's nothing new. We try not to have it around the front door, because that attracts unwanted attention to the service. But there are some people who are very desperate and do that, so we have a security guard who will stand at the front or back door just to discourage that, you know, yeah. And then obviously the police are active in the street too, and if they're standing outside of their service and doing a deal, they're making themselves a little bit obvious, and it's a bit silly for them too. We manage it as best we can, but of course we can't control. What happens outside is really an outside thing. We don't have control over that. What I can say though is the legal basis for the service is that, so drugs are illegal in Australia and there's criminal code around that. So there was an amendment to the Drug Misuse and Trafficking Act, which is the statute which makes drugs criminal in Australia. So an amendment was made to that so that when you're in this service, being in possession of a small amount of a prohibited drug for personal use is legal, and the self-administration of that drug is also legal. So it's the only place in Australia where we have legal drugs. It's legal to be in possession of drugs. I can have heroin on me, and that's not a crime if it's a small amount. And I can inject that heroin, and also I'm not committing any crime. So it's not that we've bent the law. It's not that we're, it's a police no-go zone. The law was changed to make drugs legal, but drug selling or drug supply is still illegal, and we have to crack down on that. So that's how we exist. An amendment to the legislation. That's been pretty cool. And so it's not that the drugs, and the police support the obeying of the law, And the New South Wales Police are the licence holders, and there's no offences occurring on site because drugs are legal in that one context. And then people have to get to and from the service with drugs though. And drugs are illegal outside, so we work closely with the New South Wales Police, and they've adjusted their standard operating procedures whereby they will not target people entering or exiting the service. Unless if they're doing an active drug deal outside, but if you're just walking into the service, the police standard operating procedures, they won't target you for a search. Now that works well on some days, and it works less well on other days, and we're constantly working with the police to ensure that that smooth passage can occur.
It means that you have something like a free side contract among you, police, and the drug user about behavior.
Yes. And that leads to the next question. So we're a low threshold service, which means we don't want too many rules to access the service, but some rules have been we've put on, and some rules the government forced upon us. And the rules are that you have to be an established injecting drug user when you sign up. You can't come in and have your first injection. And the reason for that is injecting is the most potentially hazardous way to administer a drug. If you're snorting or taking your drugs the other way, we don't want to support the transition to a higher risk method of taking a drug. So you have to have injected before, and we ask that question. The reality is our stats show that most people have been injecting drugs for 13 years when they first come to see us and have established harms from their drug use already. You have to be 18 years and older to access the service, and we're on the record of disagreeing with that. If you're a 16-year-old that's been kicked out of home and you've been using heroin for 2 years and you come to our service, sadly, we have to say you can't inject here. We can provide other support, but you can imagine if you're a 17-year-old and you come and you've got heroin and we say, no, can I give you some counselling? They're going to say, F you, and they're going to go and inject around the corner. We disagree with that, but we haven't been able to change it yet. You can't be pregnant to use the service. That's outrageous, and we very much disagree with that. If you're a marginalised pregnant woman who's particularly vulnerable at that stage, who doesn't have a home and so on, and isn't linked in with antenatal support and is injecting, we have to say, no, you can't use on site. That denies us an opportunity to work with the person and link them in with appropriate services. When you walk into the door to use and we say, no, but we can provide other help, the burning issue for the person is that they're going to want to use the drug, and we have to say no, and that's outrageous, and we're in the process of fighting that. We know that the worst thing for the fetus is for the mother to be in withdrawal. So far better that she actually use the opiate drug and then not be in withdrawal, because withdrawal is more harmful than heroin. And unfortunately we're challenging that at the moment too. So things are great to have these services, but there are many and varied controversies and challenges that need to be fought.
So it's given by your, because it's not pragmatic, but more pragmatical is to have contact with pregnant woman.
Yes.
It's given it's given by you. You decided to do this rule, or it's because of the church, or because
it was decided by stupid politicians. Yeah. To be frank, yeah. So some of these rules we said, but most of them are ones that the government said, okay, we'll give you a licence, but and we gave them a short list of criteria, and they expanded it to say no 18-year-olds and no pregnant women, and we just had to get our doors open and get started, and then it's a difficult process to challenge some of those things when they're set, but we're working on them.
Yeah. So it's the same with the drug users who have a child, that they have to find somebody who is waiting with a child in front of your center, and more pragmatical would be to be in contact together with them.
So I'm talking about pregnant women. If you have a child, then we're mandatory reporters. So that means if we see a child that's at risk of significant harm, we're required by law to put the needs of the child first and report that. And we're very upfront about that. It's the mandatory reporting guideline. So if somebody comes in with the intention to inject that hasn't created adequate care provision for their child, then we need to question. They can't come and inject with the child, but they have to have provided somebody who's non-intoxicated to look after the child. And if they've not done that, then we would have to call a government service to deal with that person.
No, rozuměl jsi dobře.
Jakože volají sociálku.
No, když to dítě hlídá člověk, prostě, který je pod vlivem drog, tak oni mají, prostě jsou nuceni jako v podstatě kontaktovat OSPOD, jinými slovy, prostě, že se děje něco takového.
Yeah, but it goes to situation that people are not in contact. They use drugs and are not in contact with service. What is not a good position?
So some of the things I've outlined here, you're right. That means that it discourages people. It goes against the low threshold ethos, doesn't it? No, I agree with you. The difference with having a child, though, is we want to teach people to look. If you want to use drugs, fine, but make sure that your child's safe and well looked after during that occasion. So you can't come in and become really intoxicated and smashed, and then who's going to look after your child?
I understand this controversy, but I think that it's better if the drug user is in contact and not, for example, let the possibility that he lets or she lets the child at home and goes for some hours.
But on the other hand, you cannot accept that he doesn't care about the child and he makes the child goes down absolutely because of his selfish behavior.
It's a tricky one. That we know that most of the clients we see, it's intergenerational neglect and abuse. That many of them are in that situation now because they had parents that didn't provide adequate care and support for them, and it's about making sure that we put the needs of the child first. And if that means that the child is removed into a foster care situation, then that might need to happen if there's recognised harm for that child. We don't make that assessment though. All we do is we make sure that there's adequate provision for the child and make a report, and then it's up to another service to decide whether that report's valid or not. But the licence says we can't allow access for a child, and all health services in Australia need to report identified risks of harm to a child, and that we're not exempt from that. But I do hear your point. And
on the other hand, we have some experiences from some part of countries that using drugs is accepted as a family, as a normal mode of life. Yeah. And then it comes that the mother and father takes drugs, and the children takes drugs as well, and they don't see it as a problem. Okay. So who's the responsible?
My personal view on that would be that I think it's absolutely okay to accept that the parents use drugs, but I do know that there's particular needs of children which needs to be met and addressed, and where you have intoxicated parents who aren't meeting your child's needs, that child will be harmed by that experience. We know that. And so parents who take drugs that actually say, I'm going to use drugs on this weekend, so child goes to grandma for the weekend, grandma looks after the child, and when the parents are ready and doing their normal thing, they take back on care of the child. I think that type of planned situation is okay, but when parents are in a house and actively injecting in front of a child, and the child is left in a dirty nappy for a couple of days and not being fed and nourished, those terrible situations happen. unfortunately. And in those terrible situations, the child's needs need to be prioritised, and those in contact with that situation need to report that. Again, it's an awful situation for all sides. You're trying to work with both groups to meet both their needs, and we have a system where the needs of the child come first in those situations.
And when, back to the pregnant women, when they cannot access their services, do the society provide them some other kind of services like medical control, substitution or something?
Yes, yes. So
you can refer them to them.
Absolutely. So if the pregnant mum comes in and says, "Oh, I can't come in, but is there any other help?" Or they accept their help, or if we have somebody who's a regular user of the service who becomes pregnant and then can no longer use the service, then there's a number of services that I can refer to. We have one called the Chemical Use in Pregnancy Service, which is a wonderful service that will support the pregnant drug-using mum and put them on methadone and support them all the way through the stages of pregnancy and then support them after pregnancy. Now that child won't be removed. If mum engages in health support and so on and looks after herself and engages in support and so on, then what they'll do is the Chemical Use in Pregnancy Service will do everything it can to keep mum and baby together. But it's about accepting and engaging in support that supports both the welfare of the child and the family and the mum.
And it's free for the moms.
It's free, and it's all free. This service is free. Most of our drug treatment services are free. Absolutely, absolutely. And
so
we
they do not have to pay for the methadone?
No, not particularly in that situation. So we have free public clinics for methadone and Suboxone, and we also have a private system for those who are employed, who can pay, and it's about 10 Australian dollars a day for Suboxone and about 8 Australian dollars a day for methadone.
So it's much more cheap. So it's much more cheaper than the individual drugs.
So
yes, very much so.
So they have to pay for Suboxone or not?
In a private clinic they do, and you go to a private clinic if you have a job. And for people who are unemployed, we have public clinics where the treatment is provided for free.
Okay, so the prevention is for free.
Correct, yes, yeah. Please.
Jaký je odhad na počet žen, které se dostanou, když otěhotní, které se dostanou do toho centra pro těhotnou
What is approximately the number of pregnant women who use services, this kind of service, this you refer to?
The chemical use in pregnancy, it's in huge demand. We don't see many pregnant women, so I mentioned this rule, but in fact it's very few and far between that I would come in contact with somebody who's pregnant. But in terms of the chemical use in pregnancy service, they're often always at capacity. There's a large number of people who use drugs who then fall pregnant and then make contact with these services. And most pregnant drug-using mums care about their children and their family. There's no doubt about that. And they want the support. But it's usually those people who are dislocated, who have had traumatic histories, and have a poor history of engagement with health services. They're the ones that tend to not engage in services. And they're the ones that where family and community, the government organisation will actually take the child away after they're born and put them into care. And in many situations, that's an appropriate thing because the child won't be supported. The mother, for whatever reason, simply is not capable of providing that level of support. Yeah. So we have, and all of those systems, we have a public health, an NHS type system in Australia where most health services are provided free of charge to all people in Australia.
And this service for mothers is also financed by the special fund.
No, that comes purely out of the health budget. So that's the health budget, you know.
Does it have insurance budget?
No. So we don't really have a health insurance type system. We have free public health. It's a bit like the United Kingdom in that way.
So we pay from taxes.
What's that? Pay from our taxes. We're a fairly high tax country, and that we have to pay, it's a 2.5% Medicare levy, and that means that 2.5% of our, all of our incomes goes to the public health system, and that means we have free healthcare and access to hospitals and treatment for free, and to go to a doctor for free for almost most people. Yeah, which is pretty good like that. Yeah. So access to healthcare in that regard is very good in Australia.
Just one more question.
Please.
The registration in the centre. Maybe you said that you haven't been here, but is the name of the people needed for entering the service, or do you have some special type of code, or how to do this?
So we have anonymous registration. So that means people want their privacy. So that's the criteria for entry that we assess for. And then we say, we don't ask for ID, we say, what's your first name, the first 3 letters of your surname and your date of birth. You can make it up, and then we create a clinical file, and then we create a registration on the database, and that means you use the same identity every time you use the service, but it doesn't have to be a real one. Some people use their real, some don't. We don't care, as long as you use the same criteria each time. And then we ask people to make up a password, and then when a person comes in, we ask, what's your password? We bring up their file, and then we say, what drug are you injecting this visit? And they tell us. And then we say, when did you inject a drug of the same class in the previous 4 hours? And they tell us. What other drugs do you have in your system? And we put all that information in. And that means we collect very accurate statistics about local drug trends, changes in drug trends, changes in drug harms, and it's a really good monitoring evaluation system too. And because people can inject whatever they want, there's no rules about that, so people tell us the truth. It's not like we're going to say no to them, you know. The only thing we do is when you come in, if you're smashed and you're staggering around and you can't talk, we're not going to let you in. We'll say, come back in a few hours for reassessment. It's just not safe to inject when you're intoxicated, and it's probably not safe for staff and other clients as well, you know. And so then they would have to come back. So if you're drug affected, you can come in, but if you're really intoxicated, you can't come in and inject. That's a bit controversial too. Vancouver doesn't have that policy.
So you are interested mostly about the way how he's using drugs. Are you interested also in asking about the life, where he lives, what he do?
So when a person first registers, so you asked that before, we do a 15-minute survey with the person. We're assessing their eligibility criteria, but we'll ask questions about have they previously engaged in drug treatment, what sort of housing support do they have, what other health conditions do they have, both physical and mental health. We do a mini suicide screen at that time, and then if somebody's actively suicidal, and a number of our clients are actively suicidal, then we might respond to that. So we're all very good at suicide risk assessments. And then there are participation in treatment in the past, and a number of other whether they engage in sex work, whether they have been in jail before, and that type of thing, and then the rules of the service, and then we collect all of that information, and then that gives us very accurate demographic information of who we're seeing, the issues that our clients are seeing, and what we can do to respond to that. And then over time we work with people one-on-one about their individual issues, and then develop individual support goals for each client, if that's what they want, but we don't impose that on people, absolutely. We don't expect that people will change or get into treatment because they come and see us. If that's what they want, we'll work with people towards that, but we don't impose our needs onto the clients. If they come in the door, inject safely, and walk out alive, that's a win. Everything else is a bonus. It's about keeping people alive and unharmed, and without Hep C or HIV, that's success to us. Everything else is a bonus. But people, as I said, generally want the other support, and we're ready to respond to that if they do.
How much people work at the same time in your center?
What's sorry?
How much people?
At the same time, like the capacity at one moment, how many people can be at the center at the same time?
16. So if you have a look, so this is the reception area, by the way, that I was talking about, where we do the registration and people queue. But then you go into stage 2. So this is the walk up. You can see on the right hand the booths. Do I have a picture of a booth? So these are the 8 booths. And this is where the staff sit and they get the equipment. See here. That's Julie, our nursing unit manager, handing over some equipment to a client. And then there you can see the booths. So you can see the yellow sharps container. Every time somebody leaves a booth, staff will come around and disinfect the entire booth and the chair. And then when that dries, then we will throw through to stage 1 and the next person will come through. It's very busy, 200 people coming through a day. Often stage 1, the reception area is full. And then what people, they'll get the equipment and they'll sit at a booth. Now the rule is that if you walk in together with your mate, with drugs that you got together, you can actually sit at the booth together and share your drugs. If you came in by yourself, you can't join another mate and you can't have somebody join you. The whole idea around that is, it's about drug supply. So if I give you some heroin and you say thank you, no money exchange, I've committed a crime. That's drug supply. There's no money involved or anything because I've given you a drug. But if we were outside and we jointly bought those drugs together and walked in, well, then I haven't supplied because they're both ours. So the way we manage that in terms of the organisation is, if you walk in together, we say they're jointly procured drugs. But if you join in and meet somebody up, we say you're sharing and you're supplying. We can't allow that. Does that make sense? The reason in Vancouver they only have 1 share to a booth. But drugs are so cheap in Vancouver. You can afford drugs cheaply. In Australia, drugs are so expensive, most people will buy in drugs together and share them and for practical reasons, we had to allow people to share jointly procured drugs. So there's potential 16 people at one time. Some people stay for 20 minutes, some might stay for 3 hours, particularly if they've taken a lot of benzodiazepines.
My question actually is, there is some time limit for the...
We try and keep visits to an hour, but you have to be flexible about these things. The initial rule said it was 1 injection per visit. The reality is policing that just didn't work. People will sit at the booth, they'll go on the nod, and then they'll mix up and have another shot and have another go. Or people will have a shot and have a shot and have a shot. It's just, yeah, you can't manage that sort of thing.
And is possible to applicate to neck or to the...
Oh, that's a good question. So, originally no. You can inject in the groin, and you can inject in the arms, but we didn't allow neck injecting. We are actually doing a neck and groin injecting trial at the moment, where it's against our rules. But what happens is you can sign, if you're a neck injector, you can sign up to the trial, and then we will watch you neck inject and fill in some forms, and we're going to go to our expert clinical panel with our data and say, can we now allow neck injecting? The reality is neck injectors, if we don't allow it on site, they will go and neck inject somewhere else. So we want to be able to let it. We know Vancouver allows neck injecting, but it was against our original rules. So we're trying to create the evidence base to say, look, it's not ideal, but no injecting is ideal, but can we let it on site? It's far better that people neck inject with us than somewhere else. Yeah. So we're about to allow that, hopefully. So we have an expert clinical panel that we've set up to oversee all our protocols and policies to ensure that if we're ever challenged or criticised for anything, we can say that we went through a thorough, evidence-based, expert process to guide all of our decisions on how we operate. And that's how we get a lot of things passed. And I would argue when you're setting yourselves up, that that's really, really important.
Can I just wonder, you absolutely need to dispose of the syringe before leaving the center?
Yeah, so in that yellow sharps container.
That's controlled.
What's that?
Like that's controlled that you really.
We look, if people smuggle them out, that's fine. But most people want to dispose. It's so easy to get equipment.
Mm-hmm.
People will throw out their old equipment. And then in stage 3, have I said everything I need to? Is there anything that's? I'm going to show a video that shows an overdose happening in that.
You can supervise the injection, but you cannot inject.
Correct. And we cannot let people inject inject their mates.
Okay.
And the reason behind that is so that it's obvious why we can't inject there for them. We want to skill people up to inject themselves. So if you have poor injection technique, we want to make sure that we teach you how to inject yourself safely so that if you're not there, you have those skills. If you're already injecting, it's far better to learn how to do it well and safely without doing harm than give those skills over to someone else. And we also know that if you have somebody rely on somebody else to inject you, that actually puts you more at risk. Because then you don't have that skill. And then what happens is you often rely on people who don't have your best interest at heart to inject you, who might rip you off, who might have blood on their hands, or C, might have prepared the mix for you with an unclean syringe. If you're an injecting drug user, far better to know how to do it yourself than rely on others. And there's evidence to show that. Also, legally, if somebody injects you with heroin, with your permission, and you die, the person will be charged with manslaughter because you can't legally consent to being harmed. And there's no legal consensual basis on which being injected with methamphetamine or heroin can occur. So if I inject you with ice, with methamphetamine, and you say, yep, do it, yep, that's good, and then you have a heart attack, I'll be charged with manslaughter. The consent's that was never valid.
Is it then oxygen? The
Yes.
chamber, right? Yeah.
That's oxygen. And so in this situation here, this individual here, and we have a machine here, there, it's a pulse oximeter, and you put that on somebody's finger, and it measures the amount of oxygen in your blood. When that number goes below 95%, we respond by giving supplemental oxygen. And in most cases, go, hey buddy, keep breathing. You know how heroin works. It switches off the central nervous system drive that keeps you breathing.
95%?
No, below 95%, we will give supplemental oxygen.
Because some heavy smokers
That's true. You're right. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So smoking's really crap too. That's a good point. So we have people who are carbon dioxide retainers, and they're people who've been smoking for many years and have respiratory disease, and therefore they retain. If you give them too much oxygen, they'll retain carbon dioxide, which is a toxin. So in those cases, if they're 88 to 92%, only then would we give them oxygen. But we assess that on a needs basis. But then if they're down to about 70 or 80%, then what we would do is we'd get them on the floor and we'd do bag valve mask, and then we'd give them a dose of naloxone. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment, how that works.
How many people work in your center?
So,
at the same time?
70. Oh, at the same time? There's 70 staff, but we have 3 registered nurses on duty and 3 health education officers on duty is the minimum number to keep the service open. So in stage 1, stage 2 and stage 3 there's one RN, registered nurse, and in each stage we have one health education officer as a minimum. There needs to be one registered nurse, and only the registered nurse can administer naloxone.
What is the opening hours?
The opening hours are 9:30 to 10 p.m. Monday to Friday, and 9:30 to 5:30 p.m. On weekends. We're open every day of the year, except 2 days a year when we have all staff training. So we're open Christmas Day and New Year. When do you imagine is our busiest period of the day, if you had to guess?
No.
When?
In the morning?
Yes, very good. Why do you think that?
After night.
Most of our drug users are heavily dependent, and they're either homeless or in homeless hostels where they tip them out in 6 o'clock in the morning, and they wake up in withdrawal and they come in with us and have their breakfast shot. So the queue is big in the morning, and so it's peaks, and then it slowly reduces throughout the day. Some people come in once a day, some come in 8 times a day, some come in a few times a week. We have business people who come in sometimes on the weekends. We have party revelers who come in and use some methamphetamine and cocaine on the weekends. We have the full spectrum of people coming in. Our core people are those who are homeless, itinerant, and people with significant mental health issues. I mean people with untreated schizophrenia and mood disorders for many years. And I'm not sure what it's like here, but we have a massively underfunded mental health system in Australia. Now, that's the treatment room for people who have lots of oxygen and so on, have very serious overdoses potentially. Now, if you go to stage 3, the aftercare area, that's that third area I talked about. That we have a secondary NSP, so if you want takeaway needles, we'll give you takeaway needles there. As I say, there's no reason to use needles. We'll give you a box of 100 to take away if you want. And we know our stats show that the only way we're going to reduce the hepatitis C transmission in our injecting population is to double the number of needles we give out to drug users.
What other stuff do you supply your clients?
What's that, sorry?
Which other supplies do you offer to your clients?
So 1 mil Terumo syringes. So you have 1 mil the insulin syringe, which is a 27 gauge needle. Yeah. We also give out 3 and 5 mil barrels. The plastic barrels. And we give out 21, 23 and 30 gauge needles. They're the longer ones. So some of our clients who are groin injectors will have a longer needle to inject in the groin. And some of our clients will inject steroids, and so they'll want a longer needle also. And some of our clients and we give out 25 gauge needles. A lot of our clients still inject tablets. And so they and we give out metal spoons and cotton and swabs and sterile water, particularly for our tablet injectors. So for a long time, 7 out of every 10 injections that occurred at MSIC were OxyContin, which is a prescription opiate analgesic tablet. I'm not sure if you see much Oxy here. Now it's changed. They reformulated OxyContin to a tamper-resistant formulation. Now most people switch to heroin and fentanyl, with a subsequent massive increase in overdoses. About 1 in 3, so methamphetamine's increased to about 30 or 33%. It's always been very low, but in the last 2 years there's been a small increase to about 30% of injections. Most injections are now heroin again.
Can the clients also get naloxone from you here?
Yes, and so we will train them on how to use the naloxone here. This is also the section where this is what it looks like, where our staff will work with clients around drug treatment, getting people into detox, doing crisis counselling, wound dressings, getting they can get a tea and coffee in the corner, They can read and do a crossword or read a newspaper, or they can just go straight through if they need to. But we also have oxygen in this section too, because as you can imagine, you go from stage 2 to stage 3. Overdoses can often occur very slowly, particularly if there's benzodiazepines or alcohol in the mix, and people might have a drop here, and we need staff here to respond to overdoses here too. Are there any further questions? I would like to show you a really interesting video now, if that's okay. And then we can't answer more questions.
I'm not sure if I heard right, but you said there can also came people which use steroids as well?
Anabolic steroids.
Okay.
So the King's Cross community is a very mixed one. It's the red light district. We have a lot, it's becoming more gentrified and more wealthy people are moving in. And there's a big active LGBTI population very nearby, gay lesbian population. And there's a big gym nearby. And so you get all the steroid buffs and everything walking past because it's set right in the main street. It's not hidden away or anything like that. And the service, and so people will come in, and we have a very small population of steroid injectors too that come in and use the service. Most of our population are IV injectors, but but steroids are a drug and they're administered by injection and there are risks, so we provide the service for all injectors. And it's interesting, we also run safer injecting workshops for services. So we would come to an organisation like this and we'd sit round and we'd teach you all what are the practical skills of how to inject safely that you can take back to your service and teach your other staff and your clients, and we do that quite regularly. And I run a steroid injecting module around that because the needs of steroid users are often very different from those who inject intravenously.
Yes.
So
you have special training for that?
Yes.
Because there are tens of different kinds of steroids and every.
That's right. But most of the injuries from steroids is not from the steroids alone. It's either from counterfeit stuff or it's from poor injecting technique. So we provide expert education on how to educate people around safer steroid use, and that's actually a module that I run.
And these users are separated from the drug?
No.
Okay.
We don't like to have a demarcated service. Everyone's equal and respected together. Okay. People can make a choice. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to mix with other IV drug users, then they make that choice. Yeah. If you choose to come to the service, then we treat you equally with respect and the same. We give you equipment and support as needed.
Nice.
Do you have clients who use steroids and drugs at one time?
Absolutely. Absolutely we do. Yep. We have a very small population of steroid users, but some of those will come in. I've seen one who'll come in on the weekend and inject cocaine, for example. And it was even one that actually I don't know how he does it, but he manages to inject steroids and get big, but also inject heroin as well. So, absolutely.
So, can I ask how many percent of your client is tested on diseases?
So that's a tricky one. So again, we know that the population in Australia only about 0.2% of people inject drugs are HIV positive. So that's very low. By international standards, that's extremely low. But about 70% of the population who inject drugs are hepatitis C positive, because it's far more virulent, as you know. We encourage people to get access to treatment and testing and that sort of stuff. Now that we have the new non-interferon-based treatments for hepatitis C that are now freely available in Australia, that testing for hepatitis C is really going up. But remember, we're talking with a really marginalised population of people with many other issues. Getting people to prioritise testing over other things is a real challenge. And so some of the ways we deal with that is we co-locate other services at MSIC. So if you have a look at
Takže netestuje přímo v té aplikační místnosti.
So if you have a look at stage 1, if you on the sides here, in here and here, we have clinic rooms. So we get a doctor twice a week from one of the local services who will sit in there and provide treatment services and testing services on site. It's really hard sometimes to get the service clients to go from our service to another. So by co-locating health services with us, we can provide that wraparound holistic support for people. So it's not just about supervising injecting episodes. We get people in to inject safely, but then we provide all these other supports on site if they want, including fibroscan testing. I provide smoking cessation treatment on site. So 99% of the clients who come to our service smoke tobacco, they don't inject tobacco. We know that tobacco will kill more clients that visit this service than heroin or meth or any other service. Tobacco will kill 1 billion people by the end of this century. It is the most lethal drug which has ever existed. And we know that there are disproportionately higher rates of smoking and tobacco-related illness in people who inject drugs and people who are marginalised than the general population. In terms of providing equality of access to support, we provide access to smoking cessation. And it's not imposed on people, but I have to say the uptake has been huge. Our clients want to quit smoking as much as the general population, but lack the resources and support to succeed. So I feel that in a holistic service, we should be providing quit smoking support to those who want it. And the uptake has been huge. Most people do want it.
Sorry, may I ask again?
Please,
about this number of percent for the hepatitis?
For the what, sorry? Seven out of every 10 people who inject drugs regularly in Australia sorry, thank you. Are Hep C positive. Only 0.2% of people who inject drugs have HIV in Australia, which is the lowest in the world. And the reason for...
0.2, not 2, but 0.2.
Yes. Yes, that's correct. Hold on, I might be telling you a few. Yes, that's correct, that's correct. And the reason for that is we have low rates of HIV in our injecting population. Is Australia started giving out clean needles to drug users back in the very early 80s. Australia and New Zealand were some of the first countries in the world to do it when the HIV epidemic was emerging, and it changed the entire trajectory of the HIV disease progress in Australia during that time, and that kind of transformed our situation. Now, let me show you this video and I can answer any final questions then. How does that sound? So if I go